Lucky enough not to have left for work yet, or you're not going to work today, perhaps you're working from home, grab yourself a fresh cup of coffee, put your slippers back on, a little book corner time for us. Explore social psychology with Columbia University's professor and author of Foolproof. That's the name of the book, Foolproof, Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity. Professor Sander van der Linden. He's written this book, very kindly sent over a copy all the way from Cambridge, England for us, looking at why it's so easy for us to process and believe misinformation, why it spreads in online networks, and I suppose more importantly, Professor, hello to you, good morning, why we fall for fake news so quickly. And I want to use a quote from the book as well. Whereas lies and fake news tend to be simple and sticky, science is often presented as nuanced and complex. I take away from that, Professor, tell me if I'm right, a lie is simply easier to process. Good morning, am I on track?
Good morning, pleasure to be on the show. And absolutely, most lies tend to be repeated very often, and they're also usually quite simple in the sense that it's easy for people to remember, because the producers of misinformation don't have to play by the same rules as producers of science, and so they can just make up stuff and make sure that it resonates with people and that it's easy for people to remember. And we know from lots of research that the more you repeat something, the more likely it is that people are to think that it's true, because the brain mistakes the fluency with which we can process something as an indicator for truth. And fluency has to do with the ease with which a piece of information is processed. So if I repeat something to you continually, the brain becomes faster at processing it, and so it's more likely to think that it's true.
So how do we build an immunity with this? What is the jab of science that we need to inject ourselves with? How do we try and move away from this falling for the easy lie too quickly? How do we spot misinformation?
Yeah, although there's nothing wrong with fact-checking and debunking, one thing that we know is that once misinformation takes root in our brains, it becomes very difficult to correct and undo after the fact. And that's why we've been focused on this idea of pre-bunking or psychological inoculation. And really that follows the vaccination metaphor almost exactly, just as you expose people to a weakened dose of a falsehood or the techniques used to produce falsehoods. People can thereby build up mental or cognitive antibodies when you refute them in advance. So just as with the vaccine, where you expose people to a weakened dose of a pathogen to try to predict the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, it turns out you can do the same with misinformation. You expose people to a weak dose of the misinformation, you refute it in advance, and then people can build up cognitive resistance.
As we stay with the analogy of a jab and misinformation and inoculation, I suppose the problem there is, if you to use the same analogy, when you're fighting one virus, all you've got to worry about is one jab, one virus. Here's the issue, is that social media, there's so many different variants of misinformation as well. Social media is making this a lot more complicated, isn't it? How do we try and fight that, inoculate ourselves against fake media on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when you pre-bunk a specific falsehood, you create a weakened dose and you refute it in advance, and that works against, a specific piece of misinformation. But as you said, there's so many pieces of misinformation. And so ideally what we want to do is create this sort of broad spectrum vaccine, or the idea that if you inoculate people against the building blocks of the larger techniques that are used to dupe people online, then people can build up what we call a broader spectrum form of immunity. So, for example, in some of our interventions, we inoculate people against the building blocks or the RNA or the DNA of a conspiracy theory. How that works in general, there are certain signs of conspiratorial thinking that are common to almost all conspiracy theories. And then when we test people, we expose them to a whole range of conspiracy theories from social media, and we find that people become more resistant and able to neutralize them. And you can do that with other techniques as well, like polarizing people or polarizing groups in society or impersonating fake experts. And so once people know the trick, they won't be duped by it again, regardless of what this particular instance is going to be. Now, of course, it's not full immunity, but we find that it's helpful for people.
Yeah, it's like a flu jab. It's not going to necessarily protect you from flu completely. You might get a little ill, but at least the worst symptoms won't be able to affect you. Prof, I'm going to ask you this in closing. The reason for writing this book, and you mentioned social media as what's a big issue around social media, is we all know how the algorithms work, and it essentially becomes an echo chamber, doesn't it? If I'm following one topic, I get fed more of that topic. I get fed related content around that topic, and subconsciously I then start to believe that this is actually what's going on. I've looked for it, I'm being fed it, and I start to believe it. And that's where this book comes in. And tell me, that's why I imagine you've written a book like this. This is The Jab. It is, how many pages is this? It's close to 300 pages of inoculation right here. Tell me the reason for writing Foolproof.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, online lies and falsehoods can travel faster than factual news, and studies have shown that, and people can get stuck in echo chambers where they're just surrounded by like-minded opinions, and if those are based on falsehoods, it actually becomes very difficult to correct things, because, people are now not just on mainstream social media like Twitter or Facebook, but, Telegram, Rumble, Gab, and so the landscape is fragmented, so it becomes actually very difficult to reach people with correct information. And what I wanted to do with this book is distill 10 years of research into why are our brains susceptible, how do humans interact with algorithms online that leads to the spread of misinformation, and what can we ultimately do about it to protect ourselves.
Well, I've just had this book handed to me by my producer earlier, so I've not had a chance to read it properly, but I know, working in a media agency, there's going to be a bit of a bun fight between me and the team. So congratulations on the book, Prof. I'm going to be keeping this with me. They always say that ownership is 9/10 of the law, so I think I'm going to keep this one with me. So it's available at the moment. I'm sure it is. You can find it online. Also, I've got the hard copy as well. No, you cannot have it. It's mine. From Columbia's University's social psychology professor and author of that book. There it is, Foolproof, Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity. From Cambridge this morning, my thanks to Professor Sander van der Linden. Wonderful book. Looking forward to it, to read it over the next few days.